He's escaping. All right, John chapter 10. We'll start reading in verse 1. John chapter 10. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the shepherd by the door, or sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief only comes to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them in also, and they will listen to my voice, so there will be one flock and one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. There was again division among the Jews because of these words. Many of them said, He has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him? Others said, These are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open up the eyes of the blind? Last week we looked at one more lesson or class on John chapter 9, and we made the contrast between good leadership when it comes to Jesus and bad leadership when it comes to the Pharisees. What we talked about last week was the Pharisees had kicked out the former blind man from the synagogue. They cast him out of the Jewish community. They reviled him. They humiliated him. They threatened him. They isolated him. They punished him. And their leadership, when it came to their dynamic, was a 2x4 to the face and a fist. All right? They were very heavy on the correction and threatening and things like that. While Jesus was the example of leadership that we are to follow. Jesus approached the blind man, defined his value, defined his worth. We'll go back to chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. When the former blind man was cast out by the Pharisees, Jesus sought him out, told him he was the Son of God, chapter 9, verse 35, and gave him the truth necessary to build the rest of his life upon. At the end of chapter 9, Jesus gets into a discussion with the Pharisees when they overhear Jesus and the blind man talking, and they overhear Jesus speaking to the former blind man, and Jesus tells the Pharisees that they are blind and their sin remains. So Jesus tells the Pharisees that they're guilty, they're still sinful, and pretty strong language towards the council of the Pharisees that had gathered to throw this blind man out, basically. And when we come to chapter 10, the audience that Jesus is speaking to has not changed. Jesus is still speaking to the Pharisees. He's still speaking to those who had gathered to basically condemn the blind man. And now they overhear Jesus talking to the blind man they had just cast out from the synagogue. So before we get into all the things Jesus says in the first part of chapter 10, I want to define in this text and set the scene in your mind and in my mind as well, who Jesus is talking to in this chapter. So who is it that is hearing these words? Who's the target audience of these words of Jesus? And we know the blind man is somewhere in this scene. We don't hear about him after Jesus comes to him. We know he's somewhere in the conversation in chapter 9 and verse 40. We know that more than one Pharisee is around in chapter 10. And when there's more than one Pharisee, they begin to multiply, especially when there's a big debate and a conversation going on about religious stuff. So you know more Pharisees are going to show up. So there's the Pharisees in front of Jesus. There's the blind man somewhere in this scene. And we also see at the end of this paragraph in chapter 10, verse 19, that when Jesus was done speaking all these things to the Pharisees, there was division amongst the Jews because of his words. So it wasn't just the blind man. It wasn't just the Pharisees. There was a crowd that had gathered. And they were hearing the words of Jesus as he spoke them to the Pharisees. So it's the same crowd, basically, or probably, that gathered for the mock trial. Whenever they brought the former blind man before them and they asked the parents, was he really born blind? And they were witnesses, and 2 or 3 witnesses, they established it as fact. All of this seems to be the same audience. It's just that Jesus' words become very targeted towards the Pharisees and the community that's around begins to see and hear all the things Jesus is saying about the Pharisees. Those that were near the temple probably heard the commotion or saw the commotion, and they started to gather. So this was a scene that was quickly multiplying when it came to the people who were a part of it. So just imagine the Pharisees who were leading this opposition against Jesus. They had threatened already back in chapter 9 that anyone who confessed Jesus as the Christ was going to be what? Cast out of the synagogue, be put out. The Pharisees have refused to listen to Jesus. They have refused to learn from him. They have closed their eyes to Jesus when it comes to anything. They're looking for every opportunity to discredit him. When they found out that Jesus was the man that healed the blind man, they immediately said, well, this man's a sinner because he does things on the Sabbath day. There are all kinds of ways they're trying their best to discredit Jesus and to make themselves look better and Jesus look less than them. So we have the Pharisees, we have the crowd of the neighborhood of Jerusalem. It didn't take long for all the news to spread when it comes to what's going on in this crowd that's gathering. So I'm sure that it doesn't take long for this crowd to grow and multiply even more. Jesus, like I've said, seems to be speaking more to the Pharisees than anybody else in the words of chapter 10, verse 1 through 18. And to kind of get your mind on this as well, there is no chapter break between chapter 9 and chapter 10. The chapter break was added in there later on. This is one flowing scene from chapter 9 to chapter 10. And it's one flowing discussion from chapter 9 to chapter 10. And in the last verses of chapter 9, Jesus was addressing the Pharisees, and Jesus calls them blind to the truth, and Jesus calls them guilty of sin because they refuse to see him, and they refuse to listen to him. So chapter 10 explains why that is the case. Chapter 10, Jesus explains what the picture is of the Pharisees and what they are doing when it comes to the people of God. So we have the characters of the scene. We've already been over the tension of this text, the drama of this text, of the blind man defending Jesus when it came to healing him, the Pharisees showing their anger and their hostility towards anyone who would dare go against them, anyone who would challenge them, anyone who would question them, the people of Jerusalem hearing the words of Jesus and the Pharisees having to decide what they're going to do with Jesus. So you have all this tension in the text. You have all these people who are gathered when it comes to this crowd. You have the Pharisees who are, trying to discredit Jesus. You have Jesus telling the truth about himself, about everything else. So you have the people who are hearing these words who have to make a decision. The people who are around that have gathered, they have to make a decision about Jesus and about the Pharisees. And I want you to realize in chapter 10 and verse 6 that the people that Jesus uses this illustration of the sheepfold. He's going to tell an illustration. We'll dive into it here in a minute. But I want you to notice how they respond to the illustration in chapter 10 and verse 6. So when Jesus tells them the illustration, the analogy, what is it that the Bible tells us in verse 6 that the reaction to it was? They did not understand what Jesus was saying to them. So the Pharisees either did not understand or they did not want to understand what Jesus was saying to them. And what I want to understand is that there is a very big point in the teaching about Jesus and what Jesus is saying, and that is not everyone will understand. And when someone's eyes are open to the truth, they will need help defining what they see. We always are going to come in contact with someone who is like a Pharisee, who will refuse to see what the Bible says, refuse to see Jesus, the Son of God. There are always going to be Pharisees, yes. But at the same time, there are going to be people whose eyes are opened. And I want you to think about it from a physical perspective of the blind man who was born blind and he now has seen for the first time, all right? If you were born blind and you had never seen anything in your 20 plus years of life, you'd never seen anything, you've never seen any images with your eyes whatsoever. Now you've heard these things described, but you have nothing as far as sight to compare them with, all right? You don't know what people look like until Jesus gives you the sight to see them. This guy didn't even know the difference between someone wearing clothes and someone not wearing clothes, all right? He'd never seen any of that before, all right? He'd never seen color before. The basic differences between the horizon and the sky above and the earth below. He'd never seen the difference between those two things. If you can imagine for a minute never seeing the night sky before. You've heard someone talk about the stars that are burning, but you have nothing to, kind of relate to that. You don't know what the stars look like. You don't know what the moon looks like. You don't know what the night sky looks like. So people have to explain this to you. And when your eyes are open, there are going to be the necessity of other people helping you understand what it is that you're seeing. So when people's eyes are open for the first time, even spiritually, they're going to have questions. And sometimes people will not understand a truth that is very basic and very elementary to us. So if someone's eyes are open for the first time, be patient. All right? If someone is opening their eyes for the first time to the truth of the gospel, the truth of the story of Jesus, the message of Jesus, what you learn and understand about the salvation that he brings, there are going to be questions. Be patient. Because how would you like it if you never were able to see for 20-something years, and now you're able to see for the first time, but you don't understand all the things that you're seeing? So just imagine that for a second. Not everyone is going to understand everything whenever their eyes are open. Just like this blind man is not going to understand everything about what he sees in the world. He's going to have someone explain it to him. But within the text, and you have the audience of the Pharisees who Jesus is speaking to, they were closing their eyes on purpose. They don't want to see Jesus. They have already declared what edict in chapter 9? That if anyone confesses that Jesus is the Christ, they'll be put out of the synagogue. They have already determined that they are not going to listen to Jesus as some authority. They're not going to listen to Jesus when it comes to what he says, and especially when he claims to be the Messiah, when he claims to be the Son of God. They're not going to listen to him. They have closed their eyes to him already, and they've closed their ears to him already. They don't want to understand. Now, this is even more evidence that shows us that Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees when it comes to, in verses 1 through 18, all right, chapter 10. They were blind to the truth about Jesus, even though he was standing right in front of them. They were closing their eyes and closing their ears to what Jesus said, even though he was standing right in front of them. And you go back and you see that the blind man was physically and spiritually blind when it came to before he met Jesus. His sight physically had been restored, but he also, when he came to know Jesus, he fell down and he worshiped him as the Son of God. And we went over this a couple weeks ago. You don't worship what is not God. If you're a Jew, you worship God. So if this man, as a Jew, fell down at the feet of Jesus, he understood that Jesus was God. But the Pharisees, even though they could physically see Jesus in front of them, and they could physically hear what Jesus was saying, they were still spiritually blind and spiritually deaf. And they could not see, and they did not want to hear what Jesus says, even though he's right in front of them. One commentary kind of summed it all up in a way that really hit me, and that was that the same sun that melts wax also hardens clay. So the truth about Jesus made some of the hearts there melt, and they were soft, and they were thinking about, well, this may be, Jesus may be who he says he is, while it hardens the hearts of other people. The exact same truth that was given to the Pharisees is the exact same truth that was given to the blind man. The blind man, his heart was melted. The Pharisees, their heart was hardened. So the former blind man had his heart melted by the gospel and by the message of Jesus and the truth of Jesus, while the Pharisees, in the exact same message, had their hearts hardened. And Jesus is speaking to the hard hearts of the Pharisees who have closed their eyes to him and closed their ears to him, yet they claim to see, which is what Jesus said in the last chapter 9. You are blind and you are still guilty of your sin. So the Pharisees, the leaders of the Pharisees, they're supposed to be leading the people of God towards God. And Jesus is saying, you're not leading the people of God towards God. You're taking people away from God. And this is what the whole illustration is about, all right? So just so you get the dynamic of everything going on, the explanation of Jesus in this analogy when it comes to the sheepfold and the shepherd and the sheep being in the sheepfold, all of that, him being the gatekeeper, the door, all of that has to do with the Pharisees. And it is right on target. Right on target. Anyway, the first of the analogy here, okay? There's several parts of this. We're only going to get to the first part. This is something that's very foreign to us, because how often have you said sheepfold in your life and it been outside of biblical text? Have you ever said the term sheepfold in your life besides in a biblical text? Probably not. So with our mass production of agriculture and individual barns and farms and machinery and buildings, it was very different in the first century when it comes to the agriculture of raising sheep. So I want you to imagine this. There are all of these shepherds with their flocks that are outside of Jerusalem in the Judean countryside. Just imagine this with me. So you have all of these shepherds with their individual flocks, and they're grazing their sheep on all these pastures and all these hillsides and over all these mountains, and they're looking for grass to feed their sheep. Not only in the summertime, but also in the wintertime. So it is going to be an issue for all of the grazing points outside of Jerusalem, especially those who are in a populated area, because you have to go somewhere else to find grazing land. The problem with that is, if you go somewhere else to find grazing land, you are getting away from your headquarters. You're getting away from your home base. If you're close to your home base with your sheep as a shepherd, you could take all your sheep back home. And they could be in the safety of whatever structure it is you have there. When you go somewhere else to look for grazing land, you don't have something there. So one of the things that they did was they would build a sheepfold. And a sheepfold, if you can see it behind this thing, all right? A sheepfold was basically four sides. There are two different kinds that you can actually find. There were four sides of a fence that was usually made out of stone. And this stone fence would have one opening, all right? So all the shepherds from that region would get together, they'd pool their resources, and they would make this sheepfold. So that every one sheep in that territory, when they came together, could be put in that single sheepfold. Everybody that was around would come together with their sheep, and they would all be in one place. And that one place would have one door. All right? And once again, the farther you got away from a village, and the farther you got away from population, what were you going to do when it came to nighttime? When it came to the sheep, what were you going to do to protect them? So the farther they got away from their house, what did they do with the sheep at night? All of them pulled together, and they made one of these sheepfolds. And with the safety structure built, and with their combined resources, there was a gatekeeper that would stand watch, probably one of the shepherds, and the person would stay with the combined flock of everyone's sheep during the night. In the morning, whenever the sheep would be released, all right, the door of the sheepfold would be open. That's a very cool principle here we're going to talk about in a minute. The shepherds went inside to get the sheep so they could go in and lead their sheep out. Now, just think about this picture like this. The only way that those sheep are going to get out was through that door. Unless you were a thief or a robber. If you're a thief or a robber, you don't want to go through the door. You want to take the sheep somewhere else and get them out. So, Jesus makes a very good principle and a very good point when it comes to this. The only one who would try to take the sheep away from the sheepfold, in other words, steal them and harm them, would be a person who did not want to go through the door. You get the principle? There's a sheepfold. There is one way in, one way out. The only way those sheep are supposed to go in and out is through the door. The only other way they would be out of the sheepfold was if a thief or a robber came in to steal them. So thieves and robbers would try to steal the sheep from inside the sheepfold and not go in the door. So if you were someone who went through the door, you were a shepherd because you didn't get through that door with someone at the gate unless you were one of the shepherds. Now, once again, all the flocks were mixed together at night in the sheepfold. But in the morning, each shepherd would be allowed by the gatekeeper, to go in and call for their sheep. The only ones that came through the door were the ones that were allowed. The only ones that left to go in and out and to pasture were the ones that were allowed. Once again, this is a point that we're going to talk about later. When the shepherd called for his sheep, you know where I'm going with this? When the shepherd called for their sheep, the sheep heard the shepherd's voice. Not the voice of a stranger, the voice of the one who was shepherding over them. Now, I can't imagine this because I'm not a sheep farmer. Never raised a sheep in my life, never been around them, okay? I can't imagine someone's voice being what separates all of these different sheep out that have bedded down at night. But that is what happened. The shepherd would go in and call his sheep. The sheep would know and hear his voice, and those sheep that were this person's, sheep, this shepherd's sheep, would come out, and they would go through the door, the only entrance in and out, and they would go in and out to pasture. So the audience no doubt understood what was being spoken when it came to Jesus. The illustration, they understood. They did not understand the application. They understood what a sheepfold was because they'd probably seen it several times in their life. And they knew what a sheepfold was, just like you know what a combine is, even though maybe you've never been in the cab of one before. You've never actually raised something, but you know what a combine is. You know what happens when a combine gets into a field. The same way, these people knew exactly what Jesus was talking about, but they did not know the application Jesus was making. So Jesus begins to unpack this and get way more specific and get way more simple. He says, I am the door to the sheep. Now, I want you to have this in your mind, this whole picture that's back behind the words here. I am the door to the sheep. So Jesus, he knows that these people are like, what are you talking about? And he knows that even if this is the Pharisees that he's talking to, they're like, what are you talking about when it comes to talking about a sheepfold? Jesus says, I am the door. Once again, this is a concept that is foreign to us, 2,000 years later. So it needs a little explanation for us to get it as well. I was reading G. Campbell Morgan's description of the scene where a shepherd was met in this region by someone in the late 1800s. And the shepherd, when this guy was over there in the Middle East, the shepherd gladly explained how this whole process worked. That the sheep were led into the sheepfold, right? Stone walls, opening, same thing that we're talking about here. The shepherd was then asked where his position was because it was an open door. It was not a gate, it was an open door. There's a hole in the fence, right? So the guy asked him, where is it that you spend the night? Because there's an open door, there's an opening in the wall. And the shepherd pointed to the opening and said, I am the door. When the night came and the sheep were all inside the sheepfold, he would lay across the opening of the door. No sheep ever got anywhere without crossing his body, and no predator ever came in unless it went through his body. And Jesus says, I am the door. Now, it takes a whole lot, right? When it comes to that picture, that brings a whole lot to this picture. When Jesus says, I am the door. Now, we don't see this very often. We don't see a guy, when sunset comes, laying in front of a hole that is the only hole in a four-cornered fence made out of stone. We don't see this, but they would have. And when Jesus says, I am the door, they would know what he's talking about. He's the one who's laying across the only opening for the sheep to get in and get out. There's also a very interesting position in the Old Testament place of worship, the temple, and I didn't want to go too far into this. But the Old Testament permanent place of worship, especially when it came to later on after Nehemiah and all of them, the Levites had a particular sacred calling. And it started way back in King David, all right? And the Levites, one of their callings was that they had a particular sect that was called the Keepers of the Threshold. They were a group of Levites whose only task was to be keepers of the threshold. And they formed a very sacred order that's found in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 22, and 1 Chronicles 23, verse 5. They guarded the gates of the house of worship. They would close and open the gates at the proper time, 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 27. They would prevent anyone or anything unclean from coming into the temple or onto the temple grounds, 1 Chronicles 23, verse 19. They even have chambers in the temple close to the gates where they would stay during the night. They were keepers of the threshold, and no one got in and no one got out without their allowance. They were the door. They were the gate. Jesus says, I am the door of the sheep. And then Jesus lets the hammer down on the Pharisees. And all of those who claim to have the truth outside of him, and all those who are claiming they lead the people of God towards him or towards God without him, he says, all those who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the true sheep did not listen to them. This is Jesus describing the picture of what just happened in the last chapter. The Pharisees, whenever they had that former blind man in front of them, they claimed to have the truth and know the truth, and that they were where the buck stopped when it came to authority. The Pharisees claimed to have the truth on their side. They claimed to follow Moses. They claimed to follow God. They claimed to be the door through which everyone had to pass to get to God. If you were following the Pharisees, that meant you were following God. Jesus exposed them for what they truly were. They were the thieves and the robbers who refused to go through the only door of Jesus. And they were the thieves and they were the robbers that were actually taking people away from God. The Pharisees wanted to steal people away from God by keeping them away from Jesus. They threatened people who would even dare to confess Jesus as the Christ. They didn't want anyone to have access to Jesus. But Jesus says, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, they will be saved. They'll go in and out and they'll find pasture. I don't know if you're like this, but I'm thinking about it a lot. People are constantly searching for security, constantly searching for peace of mind. We like to know when other people that we love are safe. We like to know that we ourselves are safe. We like to know when our families are safe, when our kids are safe. Parents track their kids on their phones, and kids track their parents. on their phones. Kids even track their grandparents on their phone. They keep track of their friends. They like to know that people are safe. Jesus uses a very well-known phrase, and it's an Old Testament phrase, an Old Testament analogy, a Hebrew analogy in chapter 10 and verse 9. If anyone enters through me, they'll be saved and go in and out. And what Jesus is describing when it comes to that one phrase, they'll go in and out, is someone who can go in and out of their house without fear. It's a phrase used over and over again in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 6 says a person who knows that they're obeying God is blessed when they go in and is blessed when they go out. The psalmist David knew that God would keep him in his going in and in his going out. Psalm 121 verse 8. Jesus is the door through which we find peace and security going in and going out. Those who are thieves and robbers like the Pharisees refused to come through the door of Jesus. They did not want anyone to come through the door of Jesus. The only person who refuses to use the door of a sheepfold is the person who wants to steal or harm the flock. The thief comes to steal and to destroy. Jesus says, I come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. So Jesus is the door of blessing, of going in and going out. Every part of our life has to be saturated in that principle. Now, that's all I have. All right, I wanted to get through it, and I wanted to ask you a couple of questions or see what comments that you have when it comes to this text.
Well, I've always thought that Christ, and I'll read here what it is, that he was the shepherd.
Yes, he gets to
But
that.
he goes on down there in verse 11, he says he is the shepherd.
Yes, he is not only the door, he is the shepherd.
I missed the part that he was the door over the years, that he was the door.
So we just went over the first part of it, and hopefully next time we'll go over I'm the shepherd, I'm the good shepherd. So yeah, Jesus is not only the door, he is the shepherd who keeps the sheep safe. So that's a good catch. And there's a lot in that phrase next week about I am the good shepherd, and see what all that is about. So. Oh man, it's going to be a long 15 minutes, 10.
Well, the Pharisees, I think, are a whole lot like us in a lot of ways, because we know the Bible, we know the teaching, and everything like that, but we're going to go into our own way instead of doing what God wants us to do at times.
That's true. That's true.
Somebody steps up and says, well, you're doing it wrong, kind of like get offended.
That's a good analogy. Man, we're waiting here until New Year's. Huh? I'm waiting.
I always thought the doors of the tabernacle was the same size. I read last night that they was different sizes. Is that true?
Explain.
Well, it told how wide each door was. There's 4 doors, and each door was different size.
Really?
I never did.
Are you talking about from the holy place to the most holy place? The difference between those doors?
It must be the outside doors, because they gave the dimensions of each of them, and.
Really? I never thought about that.
Church Christ that.
Well, no, it's just.
But I have never read that before. I got to study more. But I didn't know that.
That's a good question. And it was the tabernacle?
I told Steve about it. He didn't know either.
Well, don't throw Steve under the bus.
Gotta learn.
I mean, I remember vaguely about the different gates in Jerusalem being different sizes, but I don't remember any of like the tabernacle was the tear down and put back up. So I don't know about the dimensions of the doors or the curtains when it comes to that. And I really don't remember anything about Solomon's temple. Huh.
I don't know, I gotta say about it. It's in a book that I'm reading this coming year. You read a chapter, something every week,
Yes.
and it was about the tabernacle.
But I also didn't know that, like where the Ark of the Covenant was, like the cherubim's wings were 8 foot across, and they were almost touching. It wasn't just on top of the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant that it had the cherubim. There were these huge cherubim that had been carved, and the wings stretched all the way across the room. When you picture that, I don't know if they had that when I was growing up. When it came to the Sunday school, pictures, they didn't have these giant 8 foot, long. I don't remember that. I remember all the items of the tabernacle, or all the items of the holy place and most holy place. But I don't remember the cherubim being there.
I just looked this up about the gate, the entrances, but it's talking about how you got the outer court of the
Yeah.
tabernacle, so then you've got the entrance that goes to the inner court, and then you've got inside the tabernacle is an entrance, and then the curtain dividing that from the holy of holies.
Yeah.
That would be the three.
So you have the inner courtyard, you have the holy place, and you have most holy place. So you're talking about the curtains that divide all those?
That's what I'm wondering.
No, it just said the gates, that's all it said.
Hmm.
It showed the dimensions up there.
I don't know. That's a good question.
What were you reading that in?
It's a book about each week, each day you read so much.
What's the purpose of the book? What kind of book is it?
Where you can read the whole Bible in 1 year.
Where were the dimensions you're reading? The book.
I don't know about the dimensions.
Okay,
Like what I'm saying is just the entrance ways.
I got you.
Didn't say anything about the dimensions or anything. I know, like I said, that the temple all of them, they had gates,
Mhm.
several gates.
And that was like the keepers of the threshold. They were right there, keeping people in, keeping people out.
Sheep gate or
Yeah.
refuge gate or whatever.
Yeah. That would be a very interesting study. Uh-oh. All right, well, we got 5 minutes, so I was going to ask you, what was it that stuck out in this text the most when it came to you reading it and studying about it? Something that maybe you didn't know before, something that just kind of stuck out that you always remember, or maybe until next week?
I didn't know that all the shepherds put theirs in one place.
That was a big one with me. And there were 2 kinds of sheepfold that they talked about. And the first sheepfold was what each individual, I guess, the herd had at home. And then there was the collective one that was outside when they would roam and try to find grazing territory. So they had to make something that was out in that territory in order to protect them at night. So you'd have the smaller one of each individual herd at home that was enclosed with the same thing. And then you would have a larger version that was out there from all the shepherds that had gathered together to make this sheepfold. So I thought that was really cool.
Well, we know that Joseph went to see his brothers, and there must have been a lot of sheep for all of them to be out there watching sheep.
What? Yeah. It kind of reminds me of when it said that Job was the richest man in the East. Where did he keep all of his? I mean, that's a lot of cattle to have, and I don't know how he fed all of them and where they all went, how they kept them all safe. So yeah, makes you wonder. And when we get into the Passover lamb sacrifice, and you think about all the sheep that were necessary to do all that, I mean, The livestock had to be booming when it came to being around Jerusalem and Judea. You had to have a lot of sheep. Guess everybody's ready for the new year to come in. Or sleep it in. All right, Jerry, bring us home.